The tension in the royal chambers was suffocating. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows against the silk-draped walls, but even the warmth of the golden glow couldn't mask the icy rage emanating from the king. He slammed his hand against the polished wood of his desk, sending a delicate ink pot trembling. "What in the world were you thinking?" His voice boomed through the room, making the queen flinch. "I trusted you to handle this matter, yet you allowed everything to spiral into chaos." The queen, dressed in layers of rich silk, remained seated, her hands tightening in her lap. "I did everything I could," she answered carefully, her voice steady despite the anger laced in his words. "But Kyung-hoon is not a child anymore. He made his choice. And what a disastrous choice it was." The king paced furiously, his hands clasped behind his back. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What he has done?" He stopped, turning to face her. "Minister Jin Suk will not stand for this. He had everything planned for Min Seo, and now that Kyung-hoon has chosen another, he will stop at nothing to get what he wants." The queen swallowed, her throat dry. "What are you saying?" The king let out a bitter laugh. "I'm saying we must hope that that girl Jialmi is dead. That is the only way out of this." His expression darkened, his voice dropping lower. "If Jin Suk cannot have his daughter as queen, he will topple this government. He will expose everything, our secrets, our past misdeeds, every thread of power we've carefully woven. Do you understand what that means?" The queen's fingers dug into the folds of her robes. "You would rather let Kyung-hoon's chosen bride die than face Minister Jin's wrath?" "This isn't about what I want," the king snapped. "It's about survival. If Jialmi is still alive, then Minister Jin Suk will never stop hunting him. And neither will I." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. The queen looked away, staring at the intricate embroidery on her sleeve. The memory of Kyung-hoon's words flickered in her mind, how he had referred to Jiolmi as a man. A suspicion had been growing in the back of her mind, but now it weighed heavier than ever. Could it be? For a brief moment, she considered telling the king what she'd heard. But then she glanced at his hardened face, the cold calculation in his eyes. If Ji-yun truly wasn't who they thought, would that make things better, or worse? No. Now wasn't the time. She needed to confirm it first. "I will speak to Kyung-hoon when he returns," she murmured, more to herself than to her husband. The king, lost in his own thoughts, barely noticed her words. He exhaled sharply and turned toward the door. "Summon Hyo-jun." The queen hesitated. "Hyo-jun?" "Yes. I want to know why that man has not reported to me," the king said impatiently. A tense silence filled the room before the chief maid bowed low and spoke hesitantly. "Your Majesty, no one has seen Hyo-jun since this morning." The king's fingers curled into fists. Pieces were moving, and he was losing control of the board. The queen remained silent, her mind elsewhere. If Kyung-hoon returned with Ji-yun, she would have her answer. Until then, she would keep her suspicions to herself. Meanwhile, Hyo-jun stood before Sung-min and Dae-hyun, his expression grim. "Ji-yun has disappeared," he stated plainly. "There's no sign of him in the palace, and Crown Kyung-hoon is already searching. I assure you, I will find him." Dae-hyun's fingers tapped lightly against the wooden table, his expression dark with worry. How could something like this happen inside the palace? Hyo-jun shook his head. "It's clear this was planned. Someone with power arranged this." Sung-min's hands balled into fists at his sides. "Then we should be out there looking for him, not standing around here." Dae-hyun shot him a firm look. "Min Suk and Jun-ho are already out searching. More people running in a panic won't help." Sung-min scoffed. "Your son shouldn't be out there looking for Ji-yun." Dae-hyun frowned. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," Sung-min snapped. Jun-ho abandoned his own wedding the moment he heard Ji-yun was in danger. He didn't even hesitate. His feelings for Ji-yun were strong enough to shame his entire family today. His jaw clenched. That boy's emotions are a problem. Dae-hyun leaned back, watching Sung-min carefully. "Why does it bother you so much?" he asked, his tone deceptively light. Sung-min stiffened. "Because I hope he doesn't interfere with my plans and stop the marriage between the prince and Ji-yun." Dae-hyun's gaze sharpened. "Your plans," he repeated slowly. "And what about Ji-yun? Are you worried about him at all? Or is this just about your revenge?" Sung-min exhaled sharply, turning away. Dae-hyun didn't stop. "If Ji-yun dies, will your revenge still matter?" A flicker of something crossed Sung-min's face: pain, hesitation, fear. He masked it quickly, but Dae-hyun had seen it. Sung-min clenched his fists. "Whoever did this, they will pay," he said, his voice low with restrained fury. "I will make sure of it." Dae-hyun sighed, seeing the storm raging beneath Sung-min's carefully controlled exterior. "Then let's hope my sons find him before it's too late." Meanwhile, in the dim candlelit chamber of the Jean household, Minister Jean Suk sat with his sister, Mrs. Jean, both waiting for news that had yet to come. The silence stretched between them, thick with unease. "What's taking them so long?" Mrs. Jean muttered, pacing in frustration. "They should have sent word by now." Jean Suk's fingers drummed impatiently against the wooden armrest of his chair. "Something isn't right." Mrs. Jean turned to him, her face creased with worry. "Do you think they were caught?" Jean Suk exhaled slowly, his brows knitting together. "If they were, we would have heard by now." Mrs. Jin's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then, what if that Jiaomi did something to them?" Jean Suk scoffed, shaking his head. "And what could a helpless maiden possibly do?" His words were confident, but a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. Something had gone wrong. And he wasn't happy when things didn't go the way they wanted. Meanwhile, Ji-yun's eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dimly lit room around him. The scent of herbs lingered in the air, mixed with the faint scent of old wood. His head pounded, his body aching as if he had been trampled by a dozen horses. He tried to move, but even the slightest shift sent pain rippling through his limbs. That was when he noticed, he was no longer in the tattered, bloodied clothes he had worn during his escape. Instead, he was dressed in clean male garments. Where am I?" he murmured, his voice hoarse. The door creaked open, and an elderly man stepped inside, carrying a small bowl filled with herbs. His long white hair was tied back, and his eyes, though old, held an unmistakable sharpness. "Ah, you're awake," the man said with a warm smile. "I was beginning to worry. You've been unconscious for a whole day." Ji-yun tried to sit up, but the sharp pain in his side made him wince. The old man quickly set the bowl down and helped steady him. "Don't push yourself," he advised. "Your body is still weak from the poison." Ji-yun blinked. "Was the poison that strong? I was able to walk perfectly fine a moment ago." The man nodded. "Yes. A very strong one, too. It takes a while to seep into your bloodstream. If I hadn't found you when I did, you might not have woken up at all." He sighed, stirring the herbs in his bowl. "You're lucky." Ji-yun swallowed hard. The memories of the past day came rushing back, the performance, the drink, the dizziness, and then, the kidnapping. His fingers curled into fists. "Who are you?" he asked cautiously. "My name is Ha-su," the old man answered. "A simple healer and seer. I was returning home when I found you collapsed on the roadside. You were burning up, barely breathing. I brought you here." Ji-yun exhaled slowly, trying to process everything. He looked around the small, cluttered room, filled with dried herbs, scrolls, and clay pots. It was nothing like the grand halls of the palace, yet there was a warmth to it. "I have to leave," Ji-yun muttered, forcing himself to push past the pain. Ha-su clicked his tongue disapprovingly. "Nonsense. You're in no condition to go anywhere. The poison is still in your system. I've slowed its effects, but you need at least another day before you can even think about traveling." Ji-yun hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to be a burden, but he couldn't deny the exhaustion weighing down his limbs. Reluctantly, he nodded. Ha-su studied him carefully, then asked, "What's your name, boy?" Ji-yun hesitated for a moment before answering, "Ji-yun." It was a name he had never used ever since disguising himself as a woman. Even now, in the safety of this secluded place, it felt strange on his tongue. Ha-su didn't question it. Instead, he sat beside him, rubbing crushed herbs together in his palms before applying them to Ji-yun's arm. "How did you end up on the roadside?" he asked casually. Ji-yun's jaw tightened. "I was kidnapped. But I don't know who was behind it." He swallowed. "I fought them off and managed to escape." Ha-su nodded, as if he had already suspected as much. But Ji-yun noticed something strange. He never once asked why he had been disguised as a woman. No prying questions, no suspicious looks. Ji-yun studied him. "You're not going to ask?" Ha-su met his gaze with a knowing smile. "People wear masks for many reasons. If you wish to tell me, you will. If not, it's none of my business." Something in Ji-yun's chest tightened at those words. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a prisoner of his own secret. Ha-su stood up, picking up a pouch from the table. "I need to gather more herbs. Rest while I'm gone." Ji-yun didn't argue. As soon as Ha-su left, his body surrendered to exhaustion. He sank deeper into the bedding, his mind drifting. Unexpectedly, one face came to him, Kyung-hoon. The realization startled him. Of all the people he knew, why was it Kyung-hoon he thought of first? Not his father, who had never truly cared for him. Not Jun-ho, who had always been a source of confusion and pain. Just Kyung-hoon. The image of him, stern, unwavering, determined, lingered in his mind. He knew, without a doubt, that Kyung-hoon was searching for him right now. The thought filled him with warmth but also sadness. "He's probably going through hell," Ji-yun murmured to himself. For the first time, he allowed himself to admit it. He wanted Kyung-hoon to find him. And that terrified him more than anything else. The night air was crisp, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves against the dirt road. Kyung-hoon had long since lost sight of his men, having broken away from them in a desperate attempt to cover more ground. It had been hours since he had last spoken to anyone, yet he continued his relentless search, his mind consumed by a single thought, finding Ji-yun. But his efforts were proving useless. He had questioned every traveler, every merchant, even the lowest of beggars, describing Ji-yun in as much detail as he dared, even mentioning his striking yellow hair. But no one had seen him. No one knew anything. As darkness fell, exhaustion pressed down on him, but he refused to stop. He reached a riverbank, the cool water glistening under the moonlight. With a heavy sigh, he dismounted his horse and knelt by the edge, splashing water onto his face. His reflection rippled beneath him, furrowed brows, tired eyes, lips pressed into a tight line. He clenched his fists. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. The anxiety clawing at his chest was unbearable. Was Ji-yun hurt? Was he scared? Was he even still alive? The rustle of leaves behind him made him spin around, his hand instinctively reaching for his sword. An old man stood a few feet away, watching him with calm eyes. His white hair was neatly tied back, and his robes were simple, but there was something unnervingly wise about the way he carried himself. "What brings a warrior like you to such a quiet place at this hour?" the old man asked. Kyung-hoon narrowed his eyes, his grip on his sword tightening. "Who are you?" The man gave a small, knowing smile. Just an old seer collecting herbs who happened to pass by. But I believe the more important question is, who are you looking for? Kyung-hoon hesitated, but he had no time for games. Someone important. The old man studied him, his sharp gaze assessing. Does this important person have unique yellow hair? Kyung-hoon's heart stopped for a second. You've seen him? The man didn't answer right away. Kyung-hoon reached into his robes and pulled out his royal emblem, holding it up for the man to see. The moonlight glinted off the golden crest, and for the first time, the old man's expression shifted. I am from the royal house. And the man I am looking for is, someone very important to me. Ah, the man murmured, as if everything suddenly made sense. Do you know this man? Where is he? Kyung-hoon demanded. His body was tense, ready to act the moment he got an answer. The old man, Ha-soo, nodded slowly. Come with me. Kyung-hoon's eyes darkened with suspicion. If you're lying to me, or if you're leading me into a trap, his fingers twitched over the hilt of his sword. Ha-soo held up a hand, unbothered by the threat. If I wished harm upon you, you would not be alive right now. Trust me, you are in safe hands. Kyung-hoon's breath hitched. That was all he needed to hear. He sheathed his sword, though his eyes never left Ha-soo's face. Lead the way, he said. And with that, he followed the old man into the night, his heart pounding harder with every step. Ha-soo led Kyung-hoon through the quiet temple, the only sounds being their soft footsteps against the wooden floors. The air smelled of aged parchment and medicinal herbs, the kind of place that promised healing and wisdom. But Kyung-hoon barely noticed. His pulse quickened with every step, his mind consumed by only one thought, Ji-yun. When Ha-soo finally stopped in front of a door and pushed it open, Kyung-hoon's breath hitched. There, lying on a simple but neatly arranged bed, was Ji-yun. He looked so peaceful, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. His pale skin was illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern nearby, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Kyung-hoon felt something close to relief. He's alive. He's safe. Without thinking, he rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the bed. He reached out, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them on Ji-yun's shoulders. Ji-yun, he called, his voice barely above a whisper as he gave him a gentle shake. Ji-yun stirred, his brows furrowing before his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he simply blinked, his gaze unfocused. Then, his eyes landed on Kyung-hoon. He stared, his lips parting slightly, and then. I must be dreaming, he murmured. Kyung-hoon let out a shaky laugh, half exasperated, half overwhelmed. You're not. Ji-yun's breath caught as realization dawned on him, and without hesitation, he lunged forward, wrapping his arms around Kyung-hoon's neck. Kyung-hoon stiffened at first, caught off guard by the sudden embrace, but then his arms moved instinctively, tightening around Ji-yun's waist. You found me, Ji-yun whispered, his voice filled with relief, his grip unwavering. You actually found me. I would have burned the whole kingdom down if I had to, Kyung-hoon admitted, his voice raw with emotion. I was so afraid I was too late. Ji-yun pulled back just enough to look at him, his golden eyes glistening under the dim light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stared, their faces close, their breaths mingling. An invisible force pulled them together, their gazes dipping to each other's lips. Kyung-hoon swallowed hard. Ji-yun's hand trembled slightly against his chest. The distance between them was almost non-existent, and neither of them dared to move. A deliberate cough interrupted the moment. Kyung-hoon turned sharply, his expression darkening as he shot Ha-soo a glare. The old man stood in the doorway, arms crossed, clearly unimpressed. While I understand the deep emotions at play here, Ha-soo said dryly, Ji-yun still needs rest. Kyung-hoon sighed but didn't release Ji-yun. I'm not leaving. Ha-soo gave him a long, knowing look before nodding. Then you'll need to understand that he won't be moving around for a while. The poison was strong, and his body is still recovering. Kyung-hoon clenched his jaw at the mention of the poison, his grip on Ji-yun tightening slightly. Then he stays here until he's better. We're not going back yet. Ji-yun looked up at him, surprised. But. No, Kyung-hoon's voice was firm, his gaze unwavering. If we go back too soon, you'll be in danger. Ji-yun fell silent, watching Kyung-hoon with an unreadable expression. Ha-soo hummed thoughtfully. A wise decision. But tell me, young warrior, what exactly do you plan to do while you wait? Kyung-hoon's eyes never left Ji-yun's face as he answered. I'll stay by his side. As Ha-soo quietly left the room, the air between Ji-yun and Kyung-hoon grew heavy with unspoken thoughts. Ji-yun shifted slightly, still feeling the ache in his limbs, while Kyung-hoon sat beside him, his gaze intense and unwavering. You won, Kyung-hoon finally said, his voice steady. Ji-yun blinked in confusion. Won? Won what? The competition, Kyung-hoon clarified. I chose you, not Min Seo. Ji-yun's breath hitched. His heart pounded at the weight of those words. The realization sank in, Kyung-hoon had chosen him, in front of everyone, in front of the entire court. Before he could even process what that truly meant, Kyung-hoon continued. It's why you were kidnapped. I suspect Minister Jin Suk, Min Seo's father. He had the most to lose. His jaw clenched. And he won't stop. Ji-yun looked away, his hands gripping the blanket tightly. So it really was because of that. Kyung-hoon's eyes darkened. How did you escape? Ji-yun hesitated for a moment before sighing. I had to fight my way out. Kyung-hoon narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing him. You fought. Ji-yun gave a small, bitter smile. Surprised? Yes, Kyung-hoon admitted, his tone edged with disbelief. You never trained for combat. Ji-yun's expression darkened slightly. That's because my father wouldn't allow it. He was terrified that I'd get a scar, that it would ruin my value. He let out a dry chuckle. Instead, he taught me tactics, ways to evade, to turn my opponent's strength against them. Enough to survive if I ever found myself in danger. A silence settled between them. Kyung-hoon exhaled, running a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. Ji-yun could tell he was trying to stay composed, but there was a storm brewing inside him. Ji-yun hesitated before asking, what happens when we go back? Kyung-hoon's expression turned grim. Not just Minister Jin Suk. My parents. The court. They'll all be against us. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping into something more resolute. There's only one solution. Ji-yun swallowed. And that is? Kyung-hoon met his eyes. We need to get married. As soon as possible. Ji-yun stiffened, eyes widening. He stared at Kyung-hoon, searching for any sign that he was joking, but there was none. Are you serious? Yes, Kyung-hoon said firmly. If we're married, they can't separate us easily. It will solidify your position and give us time to deal with whatever comes next. Ji-yun shook his head, laughing incredulously. Kyung-hoon, I'm a man. Our marriage would be a farce. Before Kyung-hoon could respond, another voice cut through the air. It wouldn't be a farce. Both of them turned sharply to see Ha-soo standing in the doorway, arms folded, an amused glint in his eyes. Ji-yun's face burned with embarrassment. Were you eavesdropping? Ha-soo shrugged. You were talking loudly. He stepped into the room, his gaze steady as he looked between them. Your auras, they are both very royal. I already know who you truly are. Kyung-hoon tensed. And? Ha-soo smiled knowingly. And I will keep your secret. In fact, he tilted his head, I will be the one to marry you. Ji Yun's breath caught in his throat. What? Ha Su nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You two may seem like opposites, but you balance each other in ways that neither of you fully understand yet. His expression turned serious. It is destiny that brought you together. That same destiny led Kyung-hoon here tonight. It is not a coincidence, it is fate. Ji Yun and Kyung-hoon exchanged a look, both visibly stunned. Ji Yun's heart pounded, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. He wanted to reject the idea, to laugh it off as ridiculous. Destiny? Fate? He didn't believe in such things. Because in the end, no matter how much he tried to deny it, he would have to betray Kyung-hoon. Thanks for watching. Do like and subscribe to the channels for more episodes.